Hi, Dan.
Hey Pat, how's it going?
Fine. How are you?
Good, good.
Long.
We're all by ourselves so far.
Yeah, Tim put a message on the forum that he wouldn't be joining.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he said he was tied up elsewhere.
Ah, okay.
He still will have a couple of others.
All right. Well, let's see what's going
I
on.
got a message when I tried to sign in a minute ago that you'd ended the session, so that could throw somebody off if they tried.
Yeah, because yeah, okay. Yeah, one time previously I had actually. Oh, here comes Annie. Good. I had uh started it up and I wasn't in the right place, and then I noticed that there were people. Tim and Chris were in another group, and I was like, "How am I not in my group?" But yeah, the the vagaries of Zoom. I guess since then it's updated, so maybe that has taken care of everything. My cat's gonna stay right by my side today. I think he was lonely this week while I was away in Canada. What's your buddy?
Good
Morning.
morning.
How are you?
Great. Kitty looks so comfy.
Yeah, yeah. He's been the other one's on the windowsill. They've been staying very close to me this morning because I was away all week in Canada at
Oh,
this conference. So
sad.
they did not have as much, somebody came in and fed them, but didn't
Hmm.
really spend too much time with them, it seems like.
Yeah. I have a amazing neighbor who loves my cat. And so when we go out of town, she'll come over and spend like an hour every morning and every evening just playing with the cat.
Mm,
Amazing.
that's nice. Yeah. Yep.
Hmm.
I've just yeah, I've been sort of catching up this morning. I just made my morning video, and it just finished rendering, so I haven't posted it yet. But yeah, it's I'm gonna try in the next 100 days to really kind of get all my stuff in one sock. And
You weren't driving your Tesla on that trip, were you?
no, I actually traded in the Tesla. My lease expired, and I decided not to keep it. So
Would have been tempting to use the autopilot on
yeah,
such a long trip.
yeah, it does. I have a new Subaru, and it does have the adaptive cruise control. So it does, keep a good distance between the car in front of me and things like that. Um, it was I might have been able to make it to for I went the first day I went to Regina, and then the next day I went the rest of the way to Edmonton, and there might have been enough superchargers on the way. I know there are enough on the Trans Canada Highway, but I'm not sure. I was on Highway 16 most of the time, and I'm not sure that there were really enough that I would have been able to get there. That was the thing with even with a 300-mile range, there were places that I went in the Tesla that I really couldn't make the round trip. Like from here to International Falls is only about 110 miles, but if it's wintertime or if anything goes wrong, you're kind of SOL.
Yeah, I just read a thing online. Some reporter rented a EV from Hertz
Mm,
and was going out in some rural area, and he got stuck.
yeah,
Then Hertz wanted to charge him $600 for a tow or something like that.
yeah, yeah. That does seem like that would be the problem with people who are not already familiar with kind of keeping track of your range and where the next charger is and
Oh,
all.
he found a charger, but after an hour, it only charged 2% or something like
Oh
that.
yeah, the regular chargers, the charge point chargers do not. I mean, they're just it's pathetic. I don't know what they think those are for, but apparently everybody in the world has realized that now, and everybody's going to switch to the Tesla standard. So yeah. So in any case, hello, hey Chris.
All these new things.
Sorry.
All these new things. Subarus, and I see an AI companion sitting in the bottom dock here.
Really?
Oh,
When I
Oh
log in,
yeah.
when I log into Zoom, yeah, there's a little AI companion with the star in the bottom. Like,
What does that do? Oh,
Oh, I didn't, let me widen it out of it. I didn't see that.
I
okay.
presume it's something you may have turned on, or maybe now it's just
Oh yeah,
something that
AI
Zoom
companion.
has.
Huh.
Just
No, it
everything.
just updated this morning. I noticed the app when I turned it on. I don't know what it does. That's interesting. I guess we'll someday we'll find
It
out.
gives summaries of what's been happening in the meeting if you come in late,
Mhm.
maybe, I'm guessing.
Oh, really? You think?
Uh, I did see one where the AI summarizes your meeting.
Invitees will be able to
Provides
ask questions.
more than the transcript, it provides an interpretation.
Huh.
Huh.
Yeah, because if you come in a half an hour late, that's a half an hour reading, and then your hour-long meeting is done by the time you've,
Mhm.
I don't
I'm
know.
not going to turn it on just because. I know it just asked me. I just clicked on it and asked me if I wanted to enable it, and I said no, not right now. But I do have the chat running, so I got that in the sidebar. So I listened to this whole book. Actually, I also listened to the entirety of Debt again.
That's a lot of driving, Dan.
It was
Yeah.
18 hours each way. Yeah, with
Yikes.
I stopped a lot.
Yeah.
But yeah, I stopped every 90 minutes to 2 hours and got out and did some step ups on picnic tables and push ups. I did a lot of push ups, so just to kind of keep myself alive. So
Some
yeah,
potato chips to keep yourself awake.
yeah, I tried to steer clear of the potatoes. I ate a lot of pumpkin seeds. I will admit to that.
Those are the best. Those and sunflower seeds. You got to get the dill pickle flavored sunflower seeds. Okay, that's my top trip.
Well, I did sort of cross North Dakota, and there were a lot. I mean, in the truck stops, there's like a whole row of
Mm.
pumpkin or not pumpkin. There's what just the one thing of pumpkin seeds, but there's like a whole row of sunflower seeds, and with names like spitters and stuff like that. Which so I
I'm sure.
did. I thought, oh, this time I don't want to swallow them. I don't want to spit them, so I didn't do that this time. But so
Uh,
your daughter took a college visit. Where'd you go?
State Tech, it's just outside Jeff City here. She's going to study welding, so she's pretty excited. It was the
Cool.
most fun college visit I've ever been to because it's a tech institute and
Mhm.
agriculture. So they had, sheep and cows and tractors and um, all sorts of fun things to do.
Nice.
She'll be one of about 15% of a female population there. Um,
That'll be
but
cool.
it's nice. They're growing. She's very excited. It's a 2-year program.
Great. Great. And that's
So
the one she's
yeah.
decided on?
Well, she's a senior, so there's still time. She could still decide something else looks more appealing, but she's pretty into it. And she's been working and learning how to weld for a while now. So
Mm. Yeah, I never learned. I did blacksmithing, but I never really. I was like, oh, is that close from trying to learn welding? And there was a
yeah.
guy who was he wanted to teach us because he was making stock feeders from I don't
Hmm.
know what he was using, but there was a huge demand for these feeders that he was making for dropping round bales into.
Yeah, it's really interesting, the whole. I mean, there's a huge demand for the skilled trades, and there's not many people going into them and talking to some of the like the main teachers there in the kind of welding and metalwork departments. They traveled a lot early in their careers, but
Hmm.
2 or 3 of them, were talking about how they did that when they were still single and they were smart with their money and then were able to really downsize to kind of part-time teaching positions and had one of them was saying he had a couple million in the bank after he'd worked for 10 years.
Nice.
It's not a bad way to go. Yeah.
That doesn't suck. Yeah.
Right. I'm never gonna make that as a writer, so
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well,
you
and
might,
I
you
hadn't
might.
really.
If you say you're not, you're never gonna, but you might.
okay, I might. I will not excuse that out of the realm of pause. I will just say 20 years as a writer now, I've not managed to accomplish this number.
Mhm.
I will say, in my experience with writers, usually writers do not become good or successful until about the time they turn 40 to 45 because they've not lived enough to have anything interesting to write about, and they have not practiced enough to be good at their craft yet. So,
Yeah,
and
that
that's
makes
what
a lot
happens.
of
You
sense.
want to be a writer in your 20s and you give up just as you're about to enter your prime. So don't do
Yeah,
it.
I won't do it. I won't give up. Fully committed to continuing to do this thing, whether I make money at it or not, because I just feel crazy when I don't. But I came across a study. I'll have to find it, but it was something about how um, the most productive years of people's lives tend to be between 40 and 60. And I don't, remember where that was or what the parameters were or how valid the study was, but it was encouraging. I
Well,
like
that is
that.
encouraging, especially because 60 is the new 40.
Perfect. So then we really get 40 to 80 is what we're
Yep.
talking. Second half of your life. That's pretty great.
Mhm. Yep.
Annie, how do you see AI affecting your future?
Um, well, it's definitely already changed the work I do. And if I were starting out now, I would not attempt the same career path. I don't, because it's going to be prompt engineering. I actually went to like a AI kind of training session yesterday. I made it through about 45 minutes before I just gouged my eyes out and left.
Mhm.
But yeah, and I'm fortunate to have had it enough time now that I'm working full time for one company and they're small and are they're using AI, but in a very limited way. So it's not going to affect me personally a lot, but for all the other kind of writers out there, it's going to change the whole way things are done, whether you want it to or not.
Mhm.
My daughter's been using Jasper for quite a while.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I got a membership to Jasper early in the year because I need to figure out what it is and what I can do with it and how it's going to affect my work. And so I've been playing around with that one on and off. Um, I don't know. I still like when I read AI things, it's usually really obvious to me that they're AI unless someone's
Mhm.
done a really good job editing. And if you're doing a good job editing, then it's still a human production at the end. So
Yep. Right.
As a first draft, I'm finding it's quite amazingly useful.
yeah, I've enjoyed using it to give me drafts of things that I find really boring to write. Like I do a lot of technical type of tutorials, user-facing tutorials in my work. I do a lot of knowledge-based docs and things like that. And it's just like step, step, step. It's just boring to write. And it doesn't need a creative angle. It just needs to be clear. So
Right.
it's nice for things like that.
Mhm.
You do that and then just do like 2 minutes of fact checking and you're on your way.
Right?
Yeah.
Get back to writing the good stuff.
Yep.
Go write some poetry.
One
Yeah.
of the-
I did try to get AI to write a bunch of limericks for me the other day just to see what it could do. And it was real confused about the limerick format for a while. So I guess I needed my prompt wasn't good. I don't know.
One of the things I've found so far is really good references on how one should acknowledge AI writing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that was something that sort of came up in some of the sessions at this open ed conference that I was at. Is that there doesn't seem to be, and we had people from all over the world. So we talked about kind of the different things that different legislatures are thinking about, and it sounds like nobody has really figured out a way to sort of assess any type of property IP, rights or copyright or anything to anything that comes out of AI. So I guess, Annie, what you were talking about, the extensive, or substantial editing that somebody might do, maybe that will allow them to sort of reassert, some type of proprietary rights to the thing. But it does seem like it's the way, if you were a conspiracy theorist, it might be, the way to, the way that the cloud or the people who own the cloud are ultimately going to destroy copyright forever for everybody, right? Because anything that gets scraped, that goes into this sort of amorphous blob of training data and then comes out the other end as an AI production. It's going to be really, really hard to track that down and enforce, I think, copyright on that. And I think that's why a lot of people are saying, no, you can't have access to my data. But a lot of the data that they're protecting is relatively recent, and proprietary, Facebook or Twitter threads or anything like that, which is, it seems to me, kind of trivial. The things that I'd be more worried about are, like, if I were Salman Rushdie, I would be really nervous.
Yeah. Well, there's that lawsuit by several of the big name, right? I haven't read. I checked in on that a few weeks ago, but I don't know what's happened with that. I mean, that'll be interesting to see where that goes.
Yeah. It's interesting. It is interesting. I think one of the things that, although I thought this book that we've got queued up now, this Parrot and the Igloo, is a little bit flippant, I guess might be a word. At least it displays personality, right? I mean, maybe it's because I listened to it, rather than reading it first. But there is, there's a good deal of I think the author's personality in there, which makes it at least a little bit kind of more interesting.
That's kind of funny, because the one thing I've only read the first section, but I'm already kind of irritated with some of the little writing styles, like the list sentences with no ending conjunction before the last item, that like the first time was fine, and then the fifth time I was irritated by it.
Or my favorite, when he does the lists, it's usually, and I noticed it and it's gotten annoying, he takes something that happened in the past and then analogizes it to two or three things in the very recent past that just seem super anachronistic in comparison to the thing he's doing. And it's happening like every 3 or 4 pages, like, or at least enough that I have started like tracking it and writing it down. Like, this is just a terrible habit. And some of the things are just so fantastical compared to the original. It's like you have the original and it's actually an easy thing to understand. Do you really need to analogize it to, something like Facebook? We don't need, or maybe I guess there's so little context for kids now who have grown up in a Facebook world. Like, what's an 8-track tape? So yeah, I better explain what an 8-track tape is and analogize it to some modern technology, like, oh, it's like streaming music, but with physical media.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
And now that I've said that, I'm going to read that somewhere in the next, 2 chapters. It's going to.
I feel confident that the stylistic choices will continue through the rest of the book.
Yeah, they do. Sorry.
Maybe I should listen to it instead of read it. Maybe that would be less annoying.
But let's get to some substance before we, just back. Although before we do that, I mentioned the AI thing because there was a pop-up as I entered. And I now also see that there's a little summary tab next to the AI companion, which looks to me like it does the same thing without playing with it. But for our purposes, look a few down and notice that there is also, at least for me, a tab for whiteboards.
Yep.
I think it'd been there in bits and pieces, but there's another new one called Notes.
Yep.
Has suddenly popped up.
Yep.
For shared
all
notes
sorts of things
in the space too, which is a whole other crazy. But don't let me distract, because I think like you, Dan, I I didn't do the 18-hour drive, so I'm probably about halfway through Parrot and maybe a quarter of the way into Graber
Mhm.
already. And there's a lot more fun and interesting meat to me in Graber.
Oh, hell yeah.
Um, but I and maybe you can speak to it since you have gone all the way through Parrot. But I find it very odd that the whole first third, the science stuff, on first blush so far, doesn't seem to add anything to the climate change, or he's not making it super obvious what's going on. Why are we talking about these technologists in terms of, I mean,
Mhm.
it's he doesn't make it super obvious, but obviously using all this energy and power is part of what's going to do this thing.
Mhm.
But if it's me writing this book and I want to make that point, I'd probably start with we don't have any power besides horses or animals, so we're going to use people, and
Right.
slavery isn't a bad thing, or is a bad thing. And so as power becomes more readily usable, and I think he mentions a couple times, there was one of the quotes from one of the technologists that life is just going to be work is going to be at the touch of a button, which ostensibly is true these days. I mean, I
Mhm.
have a whole bunch of buttons in front of me that I push all day long, and I'm not out in the fields,
Right.
with a horse trying to
Hmm.
sweat my way into crops.
Mhm.
Um, but I would have started there and done humans and slavery as the work, and then even some industrial revolution. But instead, he's starting in the like 1700s and going, well, we're well into the industrial revolution at that point.
Yeah.
Why not mention James Watt? Why not mention, you know,
Mhm. Well, it's weird. I think he is attracted to personalities, and and I think he really wants to make this. Like right now, I've got it up on my screen, and I'm on like page 7 of the Kindle, and he's talking about Thomas Sully and um, who he's not really talking about Sully, but he's talking about Morse, Samuel FB Morse,
Hmm.
and but he talks about Sully because coincidentally Morse sails home from Europe on a ship called the Sully, and Thomas Sully is an American painter, and is a well-regarded American painter, and Samuel Morse, he's the way he's portraying him is not.
yeah,
Although he did, I mean, I don't know that that's entirely accurate. I mean, Morse painted a very famous portrait of John Adams in his older years at the end of his presidency, and so so he traveled in interesting circles, and he got to do some some significant work. The way there are he throws in interesting kind of things about what a racist asshole Morse was, and which is interesting, but is it relevant? And
he's doing that so he can sully his name a little.
there you go, nice. And then yeah, so I guess it is worth asking, how relevant to the story of climate change could the difficulties that Morse had in getting the telegraph up and running, where's the connection there? I think that probably the this is I liked the sort of the vignettes, and I do like that that kind of finding out about these kind of details of people who I like the disagreements. He didn't really go into a lot of the issues between Tesla and Edison, and and how Westinghouse is involved in that and stuff. I thought it was interesting. I think that probably of all three sections, the first, and he did sort of claim that you could read these separately or you could read them out of order and somehow that would work. I don't think that is that. I think the big takeaways from the first section for me, having now in light of the second and third sections, are the thing that he keeps coming back to. I like a hustler. That Edison quote that he keeps using and using and using, and then also the light bulb, because spoiler alert, the big event that he complains about at the end of section 3 is that instead of doing something real and substantial, what they did was they banned incandescent light bulbs. So that will be, so this is sort of foreshadowing that a little bit, but it's a stretch.
Yeah, I'm just sitting and reading through that, and maybe halfway through the next section, I was disappointed that I spent the time. And I say that too as my area is information theory, which is broadly what Morse and Tesla and Edison, so I've got degrees in electrical engineering. These are all bits and pieces of history I've seen and read 10 times.
Well, and your background is deeper than his.
I don't need to.
Right.
Although I don't think any of the stuff I've read, mentioned Morse's issues with ballet, let's say, but do I really need to know that? Like,
well, that's the thing is, occasionally though he sort of, for me, he sort of redeems himself, like the Dylan Thomas, the gaslight bubbled like a diver. I hadn't thought about that. The sounds, sort of the kind of. I mean, he does some decent scene setting, I guess I would say.
From that perspective, I will say that he has tipped out his Zettelkasten in a creative and well edited way.
Yes,
at least he has done that well. Or to even, unless he got it from somewhere else, the fact that he's on a boat called the Sully and made that connection, because unless you've probably read that in some other biography where some other biographer probably made that connection, it's not him making that connection. So I'm not as impressed by him surfacing that as I would be in an original.
Yeah.
Because to do that's some work. That's some serious scene setting to draw those contemporaneous, or even to do small little things like one of the things I did appreciate is, Morse is born a mile away from where Franklin, and within a year of his death, which helps give you, a more solid timeline of where these people are, when they're working, what they're doing,
yeah,
how they're doing it.
Well, yeah, I agree, and the idea that and I hadn't really been aware that. That the arc light was sort of this intermediate thing, between sort of, and I didn't buy the whole whale oil thing. It's like, well, okay, you're just repeating silly, mythology.
Summing up all of Moby Dick is it's just a hunt for oil, I do appreciate that Annie started us off with a welding story. As we're going into the arc light.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Because
I do think.
Go ahead.
Like, who is this book written for? I think is the big question. It's a New York Times bestseller. It's written for people more like me, I think, who don't have this in-depth knowledge. I haven't read a bunch of biographies of any of these folks. I have just a very rudimentary understanding of conflict and. So it feels like to me it's very much focused on these little personality details to draw in the maybe non-academic, non-historian, non-information theory average sort of person to care about this sequence of events and understand their place. And I think, I mean, judging just from the one section, he did a pretty good job at making these people seem real in
Yes.
a way that, you know, they often do not. So hearing about, you know, Tesla's little idiosyncrasies and you know, the different conflicts and you know, Morse's racism, like all of those things. So if that's kind of what he's going for, I think he did a pretty good job.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. Well, and I agree, and I think that he does. You know, he sort of. I mean, if this would be the first thing I read about these people and this time period and these events, I think I would respond positively. I think I would I think I would think these are interesting people. I want to learn more about them. You know, which is I think kind of mission accomplished, right? Yeah, so I do think that there's I think that, you know, he's not as wrong as he could be about the things that he leaves out. You know, he could have, because he doesn't really kind of go into, for example, that triangle of Westinghouse, Morgan, Tesla, or Edison, or maybe it's a rectangle, and you know, but at least he names the names, right? And so you can, you know, so you could kind of pursue that and follow that. You know, and he does name a lot of names: Cataract Construction Company, Niagara Company, you know, all that stuff. Yeah. I think is interesting and is
he continues that in the next part,
yeah.
And I find those stories a lot more interesting. I think in part because I don't know those players as well.
Mm-hmm.
They're not as famous, and it gives some context to kind of who they are.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, too, and I'm certainly going to be the minority coming to that first section, knowing a lot more about those people already than the average reader. But I'm also, because of the title of the book and the subject of the book, I'm coming for what shows up in part 2. Yeah. So to me, part 1 doesn't really set a scene I care about with respect to where we're at and why we're here.
Yeah. Yeah, so I agree. I think it would have been perfectly acceptable, really, you know, and you wouldn't have lost anything by skipping part 1 as far as you know,
yeah,
the import of parts 2 and 3 kind of go. So yeah,
or unless maybe I come back and circle around to it at the end to figure out where he's, because he doesn't even seem to be leaving a trail of some kind of breadcrumbs for how that first part is going to tie into parts 2 and 3. And maybe I'll see it in retrospect, you know, although I think Dan, you know, may have, you've spoiled it, but I don't think the spoilage you have done is really that heavy, because there wasn't that much to begin with.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it is interesting how he connects. I mean, he does sort of connect some of these dots. You know, John Tyndall, the Irish physicist, you know, is working with Edison, you know, in phase 1, you know, kind of before he becomes a character in phase 2. So there are these kind of little connecting threads. You know,
so you're saying you're a fan of 2-phase electricity, so you're on team.
I'm totally on team Tesla.
Yeah. Okay. I also noticed, since we've mentioned arc welding, and you mentioned that they're going to get rid of incandescent. One of the main places that arc lights still exist in popular society and culture, and most people have no idea. Every time you go to the movie theater, you are watching an arc light for several hours. In fact, I don't know if they're in other parts of the country, but there is an ArcLight theater in Los Angeles. and that's the name of the theater. But it's also, they're usually super big, super powerful. Like you need some math there.
Yeah.
I had a 1,200 seat single screen theater that used a 4,000 watt arc light bulb, which is probably it's in the top, I don't know, maybe 10 largest theaters in the United States.
Mm.
And the power that was going through our projector was a little higher than the average Cineplex.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, if you left that thing open, you could get a nice tan in the winter.
Right. But well, and that's why the celluloid gets cooked, right? If it's not moving as fast as it needs to
Oh
move.
yeah, if it stops for a
through the
second,
mechanism.
it's toast.
Yeah.
Dan, you better pet that cat.
Yeah, he's okay.
No, if you
Aw.
do that, it just
Probably.
encourages it.
He'll probably, he's gonna go probably bring a toy back and want to play fetch. So, but I do think, but to go back to sort of the way that this book deals with details. I like the kind of the Roger Revelle thing. I like the whole Fourier and the French Revolution, and sort of kind of connecting these things again, like you were saying, Chris, with Franklin and Morse, in time and space. I think it does help kind of to anchor this and to sort of. So I think it again, which is really again setting, right? I mean, the whole thing is he's contextualizing and setting scenes. I think is one of the things he's doing.
And not to get too far ahead, but that kind of contextualization, I think, works better, at least in the part of the second chunk, and especially in terms of we're building the science. And it's happening over a long enough period of time. Everybody is forgetting what we've done before, which is, I think, part of what gets us into the trouble we're in. Is you get distracted by a war, you get distracted by all these little things along the way, and you forget, oh, hey, we're doing this terrible thing to our environment.
Yeah. Well, and it's weird because and also I think one of the things that struck me as interesting was the Nobel connection. There's there's all this connection to Nobel prizes, right? To Arrhenius, and running the Nobel Institute, and then later in part 3 to Linus Pauling and his 2 Nobels. And so what does that mean about and so, but the story that he tells about Linus Pauling is not this heroic story necessarily that you would expect for this guy who wins first a science prize and then the peace prize for his
well, I think we have, as a culture, especially when it comes to technology, a lot people generally, and you can see this happening in part 1, this new technology comes out and no one knows what to do with it. We've got electricity for 100 years before somebody figures out, oh, what can we do with it that's useful beyond kind of a simple parlor trick, maybe. But then once it does catch on, then everybody is all in on it. And hey, isn't this the greatest thing ever? And how long does it take you to get to phase 3, where that thing that's caught on now and it has become big actually may have some ill effects for you? And so you have that, and it's much more obvious now because those cycles have become smaller. So within a decade or less, you can, oh, here's this new thing called Twitter. Isn't it awesome? Some people get it early, other people don't understand it at all, but then suddenly everybody's all in on it and it's all rosy and great. And then, oh, but wait a second, there are some, the timeline is much smaller, so you're seeing the ill effects much closer to the thing catching on, and then more and more people see what the ill effects can be and why and how to fix them. Whereas the broader issue that we're looking at here, the climate change piece, the ill effects are so slow and creep up on you. It's not like cigarette smoking within your own lifetime. If you smoke cigarettes, you're going to figure out what those ill effects are before you're gone. In fact, they may be the thing that makes you gone and kills you.
Right.
So can you as a human figure that out? And I think as humans, it's difficult for us to see what the ill effects of all these things are, because we don't see the tiny incremental changes aren't happening necessarily to us directly right now today, or we're not able to put together the complexity of all the things going on to see that. But it does look like a story that's being told a couple times throughout the piece. I'm curious what happens in the end of part 2 and then all of part 3 to highlight those, what that may be, or if that's even part of his story.
Yeah. Pat, you mentioned in the chat that we've got two things going on: criticizing the writing style and possibly the points. I think the writing style, I think it does occasionally kind of, it's on the border of being a little bit too conversational. But on the other hand, he drops so much useful stuff into it that I think is interesting, and just like, and I guess I'm in part 2 now, so maybe we should still continue to talk about part 1. But Humbert, going off to a climate change conference in Lolita is, how that is really an interesting and valuable, sort of tipping out of the entire Zettelkasten.
I heard that part 2, and that's the first thing I thought was like, holy crap, like he's gone deep on this.
These are deep cuts, yeah.
But he's also doing it in a way that's reasonably, and I think that's some of the thing. I don't know if he gets into it, but part of that is the power of story. And can you tell for what is a super critical and crucial issue of our day and our time, and can we fix this thing? Are we going to change the cycles of knuckleheadedness in the past that people have forgotten and have to revisit? Will story be the thing? And you can tell some of these things he's talking about are technical and can be very dull and dry. I mean, you just say the word Fourier, and a lot of people, if people know who he is, like, you're asleep.
Yeah. Although, and there are interesting things, again, that I said if I hadn't already kind of known some of these things, I would be saying, I want to follow up on that. I want to follow up on that. There are some things that, even knowing these things, I did not realize that Arrhenius, thought of the First World War as an energy grab. On page 59, he's talking about. He wrote his last book, Chemistry and Modern Life, to scare readers. Dwindling energy resources would be the cause of the future's wars. States which lack, throwing lustful glances at their neighbors who happen to have more than they use. Nations grabbing oil from lands on the other side of the seas. A mining expedition in uniform. So that is interesting. That there's somebody.
What year was that written in? Did he give a date for that?
He said 1925, Chemistry and Modern Life. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's pretty impressive, because I was going to say it wasn't really until after World War I was done. If he wrote it before World War I or during, like, that's super prescient.
Yeah.
It wasn't until like June 1919 when world powers literally carved up the Middle East.
Yeah.
Gave us all the problems we're seeing in the Middle East.
Right. Yeah. The old
encapsulated there. But even to say that in 1925, that's a huge.
Yes. Yeah.
That's a huge thing to notice.
Right. Yep. And he goes on to say one solution would be to dilute the power of individual companies and nations. It's clear that someday we must come to forbid national egotism and profit-seeking industries from seeking a solution to the problem of the proper use of raw materials, he wrote. So so I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to highlight that. I'm going to go back and and look at that later, because because that is, yeah, I mean, that's cool. I mean, that
That's
somebody is,
super
that somebody
prescient.
is paying attention at that point, and and is seeing it, kind of from that perspective, because yeah.
But that's
So
the thing too, though. Who in 1925 is reading Arrhenius
yeah,
and paying a lot of attention to him? That's
right.
if you're a journalist, you could say now, hey, there's where the turn is. But who in 1925, other than the person saying it, is going to be?
Well, that is, I think, worth actually digging into and finding out, because I mean, I think that there's sort of a lack of understanding nowadays amongst historians or people writing about it, that that something like Scientific American itself was this really, really serious kind of journal, almost academic journal level thing, that that was available for a popular audience, right? And even into the probably to the middle of the century, right, when serious people are writing articles in I mean, in quantum physicists, and when people are writing articles trying to translate really, really complex stuff that they're doing into more or less kind of everyday English, so that intelligent readers, but not expert readers, who are part of the discipline, can understand it. And there's something going on there too that doesn't really happen anymore. Gee, the other thing that I think is interesting, and maybe I spoke too soon. The idea of sort of PR, and he doesn't maybe talk, but maybe there's been enough people who have talked enough about sort of the way that advertising and public relations become a thing at this point, and and who's involved in that element of it. But this idea, GE, the initials of a friend, on page 46, this idea that that we're that myths are being made, and that hegemony and and common sense in the Gramscian way of thinking about it are being kind of constructed at this point.
Well, it's hard even for us to see the longer term effects of some of those technologies. So somebody like Tesla, and I think they even gave a date. Yeah, it was 1894 is when he gave that quote that his invention's going to save the labor problem.
Mm-hmm.
The hard work of the future will be the pressing of electric buttons. I mean, that is super prescient in 1894 for him to even be able to see that. But it's also, if I remember, I don't think it's until well into the 1900s that humanity as a whole passes the turning point where the vast majority of humans on the planet are subsistence farmers.
Mm-hmm.
So all these people in the first section are not just the elites, they're the super elites of culture, society on the entire planet,
right?
Solely by the fact that they're not subsistence farmers and eking out. So even at that time, to own a tractor would have been a luxury to 98% of the population on the planet.
Yeah. Well, and even if we restrict the conversation to America, right? It's not until roughly 1920 that more than 50% of Americans are urban. And although in the U.S. probably the farm, the centralization of farm machinery happens kind of at the beginning, the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. There is, we don't get like rural electrification
Yeah.
until the third decade, right? And there is that, and I guess another thing, the spoiler alert would be that the Kansas housewife who writes to Edison
Yeah.
on page 42, there'll be a contrast to what in the third section to what happens when people lose access to these things that between 1921 and 2000 something,
Yeah.
or in 80 years, these luxuries become absolute necessities, right? So there's kind of a little bit of a
There's
there.
when I read that too, that reminded me of there's I think a full chapter in Robert Caro's Johnson biography where he sits and he went down and interviewed women in Texas who lived in that pre-electrification phase, and they talked about the like pure back-breaking work they did every day from sun up to sundown to make their lives work. And they literally were scratching out and eking out a living, but it took a humongous toll on their bodies. And it wasn't until after they had electricity that suddenly, like, yes, we're living in the lap of luxury solely because we have electricity. And I don't need to go down. I can put my clothes into a washing machine. I don't need to go down to the creek or the river and spend hours beating and flogging my clothes against a washing board to,
Right.
to have clean clothes even once a month, much less on a daily basis.
Yeah.
I can go to my closet and pull out one of 50 shirts. No, not that many. I'm a guy. I've got 10, let's be honest. Just enough that if I go more than a week without doing the laundry, I might have a clean shirt or two left. But
Right.
That 50 years ago in some parts of America, that was not even remotely a reality. And still in large portions of the current world, that's not a thing.
Yeah.
But then do I on a daily basis think about and appreciate, and so I'm glad Robert Caro spent time, and I think in his little biography, his own autobiography, he actually writes about having done that and the value as a historian of having gone and done those interviews to document that piece of work that is really some of what makes that biography an awesome piece of work is that those pieces that you would never contextually put into place, particularly coming from a privileged modern perspective, appreciate like really what's going on or what happened. I mean, it's one thing for me to read about the condition and the state of bones from an anthropology and an archaeological perspective of the slaves that built the pyramids, because we have found those sites, uncovered those bones, and we can look at from a scientific perspective just how bad those slaves had it,
Right.
like dragging blocks of stone across the sand to make the pyramids,
Right. And
but
nutritionally and all
can you putting that into a more modern perspective of that same thing was happening up until the 40s and 50s in the United States even, and still now in other countries. Nobody, it's very rare even in Southern California. There are a lot of, what's a good example? There are a lot of Guatemalan immigrants who live in Southern California and are still toiling away. A lot of them are day laborers or they're working and cleaning people's houses and taking care of people's kids, but they're super easy to notice because they're 4'8" to 5'1". They are tiny people, and they are tiny and short because of where they were born, where they grew up, and the nutrition they had to age 5 and after.
Well, and probably also epigenetically, so it'll probably be a couple of generations before
Oh,
that
yes.
that works itself out.
But because I know what I know, I can look and see that those effects happening. Everybody else, oh, they happen to be short and they don't think twice about it.
Right.
But if you ever see a 6'3" person from Guatemala, you can immediately infer something about their socioeconomic status
Right.
in Guatemala
Mhm.
just based on that fact alone, because
Right.
statistically,
Right. Yeah, fourth generation. If you count the immigrants as the first generation, right? So I'm fourth generation, and I'm 5'4". So there's a lag. I mean, it takes a while to work itself out. I'm not. I mean, there are people in my extended family who are taller, but apparently I got the short genes.
or when you hear stories of George Washington being, 6 feet and change,
Mhm.
like it's pretty easy to see that at that time and at that place, that marks him as not only someone of privilege, but someone of privilege for multiple
Generationally,
generations.
right? Yep. Yep. Well, and what that throws an interesting kind of perspective on the things that white Western settlers or colonists or whatever you want to call them said about the natives on the plains when they arrived and saw these people were giants. And if you look at even if you look at like the early maps, Captain John Smith's maps of Virginia, right, in his early books, right at the beginning of that period, every native is a giant, and they are big, and and there's a famous kind of drawing illustration that's probably by John White, who did all of the drawing of Captain John Smith capturing, it says, the chief, they say Chief Pine, but it's probably his brother Opachancanough, and Smith is little, and the native guy that he's grabbing hold of is big, and the only thing that Smith's got going for him is he's pointing a pistol in his face. So it was apparently it was very they were very intimidated in a way that they probably didn't admit, but it's reflected in the kind of the attitudes
You don't think about it, but that's an easy public health indicator
mm-hmm.
of how well a society is doing, is how you can have some basic food, shelter, and clothing, but how healthy is the population in a general sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Or if you look at America, we're all big and heavy and obese, and our cardiac health is in the toilet. So really, does that mean we're doing well, or we're doing bad, or we're just
mm-hmm. Yeah,
doing too well by some measures, but as a result, horrible by all the rest?
Yeah. Yeah. I think there are some interesting things that this description in part one of the inventors and kind of the world, and especially the kind of, he continually kind of goes back to the financial side of it, the 1890 financial crisis, when Barings goes belly up, and then the crisis of 1892 93 in the US, which JP Morgan has to kind of intervene in, and then he'll intervene again in 1907. I think that there is, this is a kind of it's interesting, because I think this is kind of a very conversational, going back to kind of form versus content again, to Pat's point. It's kind of a sort of a breezy conversational description of some things that I think are really worth digging into and knowing about. Especially the ways that that capital and and concentration of capital and the names are a little bit of a breadcrumb trail for that, I think, for somebody to kind of look into.
Well, if you look at it from an equality perspective too, a lot of people look at money as the thing, but if you also look at what forms of, and I don't mean political power, but like physical power, electric power, do people have access to? So if you're a stockbroker and you have access to loads of power to power your computer so you can sit and press buttons all day and make trades versus the power that a McDonald's employee has, or a farm laborer in California has, who has to sit and manually pick fruits and vegetables. The access you have to that power tells a whole lot more about your station in life than even the money equivalents are ever going to. Pat's comment about first getting electricity and kerosene lamps. I was born in 1974, and about the time I was 15 in the late 80s, early 90s ish, I went to my grandmother on my dad's side was a family of farmers in Illinois, and she was probably in her 70s, 80s at that time. We went out and visited her childhood home, which was next to their old farm, and she had long since been living in the city. No one was in the house, but the house literally had metal fixtures for gaslight in the early part of that century.
Sure.
And even then she was part of the more privileged side. They had thousands of acres of farmland, even in the early 1900s. And I think when she died, I don't know if I'd have to ask and figure out, but her family, she and her sister owned several thousands of acres of farmland that I actually kind of feel a little bad that the family didn't pool resources together to keep it and continue farming it. They all decided, I think there were 7 direct kids who inherited that, and they all were modern and grew up in a steel town, and most of them were steel workers whose steel jobs left 20, 30 years ago, and now we're kind of poor and destitute. So it's like, yes, we have to literally sell the family farm because we need the money so we can live, but that means all those generations of value that had built up literally in a half a generation is gone at the snap of fingers.
Right.
None of their kids or grandkids will ever benefit from that ever again.
Right. Yeah, and it's gone just like that since then. Yeah, it's kind of like being at the wrong place at the wrong time. Yeah, I think the more I kind of look at this, as I'm kind of going back and forth through the pages, I think he does a pretty good job. I think that there's a lot in here. I mean, Henry Stanley makes an appearance, like what?
There are 1 or 2 spots where I had listened to the first chunk and got about halfway through the book
Yeah.
And I've listened to the audiobook version as my kind of inspectional read.
Right.
And so then when I went through it and read a little more analytically with my eyeballs, as we always say with our daughter, who only likes to read by audiobook, and I'm like, no, you got eyeball reading. You got to do some eyeball reading today.
Yep.
Um, he
That's funny
does
that that's a thing we have to say now.
there is a section when he's talking about Tesla and Niagara in 1896. And they're saying, hey, who's going to use the reporter, who's going to use all this, who could find a use for 100,000 horsepower of electricity.
Mm-hmm.
And Westinghouse is like, well, all the power here can and will be used. He knows it is.
Mm-hmm.
But Lipsky puts it into context with a parenthetical, which I think shouldn't have been a parenthetical. It should have been like, here's the main point of what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know how he puts this in parentheses after, but he says that as of our century, that much juice, the 100,000 horsepower of electricity, would illuminate the city of New York for a little under half a minute.
Yeah.
Like, so here's the point of the entire first section, I think,
yep.
in one sentence.
Mm-hmm.
That he makes a parenthetical.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why I would even read this first half, or this first section of the book. This is the evidence I'm looking for where we're going and why we may be on the right or wrong path.
Mm-hmm. Well, and
how we can do better.
I agree, and also that it wasn't inevitable, and it wasn't and that there was a world that existed before this stuff that we all take so much for granted. Yeah, I think that, yeah, I think you're right. I think you've made the case for the section 1 being at the beginning.
But the tough part is it's literally one sentence.
Yeah.
Amongst what, 3 or 4 chapters.
Right. Which could be an editor. I mean,
if you were see, he puts it in parentheses. I'm like, what that? I mean, maybe put it in italics. That's appropriate, or bold. But to parenthesize that is like, that's what we're here for.
Yeah. I think. I wonder if this is an edit. If this is about the editorial process of kind of constructing this as a potential bestseller, because it does. I mean, I'd like to see sort of the notes and the draft from which this came, because I think that there's probably a lot more there. I mean, one of the things that I found really fascinating that I hadn't been really aware of also is this idea that Edison, that what made him was the phonograph, and what sustained him through that, that research and development phase of the light bulb that we all think of is, this other thing that he had done previously, and that even kind of allowed him to sort of turn his back, once he loses the company on, I hate electricity.
Yeah.
Like, wow.
Or even that, and it seems a small thing, but they compare the amount he invests into his electric substations, on the order of a couple $100,000 tops, versus what Westinghouse is spending. Was that like 8 million, I think was the number? Like, they're spending like 10 times what Edison is.
Mm-hmm.
But they're also doing it at a time where transmission cost and the engineering piece of how are you going to do this, and because in our book club we love quoting The West Wing, we can go back to that episode where they talk about the reason why we just don't cover the state of Arizona in solar panels to get all of our national energy needs is because the transmission cost of moving that power from Arizona, even outside of the state to the next state over, you lose it all, or almost all of it, in transmission costs, which was the thing. That was the real battle that Edison and Tesla were doing. And it's hard to battle out the science in that fight when you know after a century of engineering work on both sides that DC is not going to cut it ever.
Right.
It's just not going to. And it's going to be AC is where you're going to. But he doesn't even really make that as a kind of fundamental scientific, this is how it works and why. That, you know, Tesla by sheer force was eventually going to win. His idea was going to win only because the engineering behind it and the science dictates that it will win.
Right.
And then DC just can't do that unless some genius comes up with some plan that, you know, and if it does, it's going to come 3 centuries from now that DC is a better thing possibly. But
well, once we have, I mean, I think once we have better storage technology, then that'll change a little bit.
Yeah, but it all has to be local storage technology. I mean, it was kind of a nice little touch that I think somewhere in there, he mentions, you know, the reason your power brick on your you know, Mac computer gets hot is because it's converting that AC electric into a DC power source that your computer can actually use.
Right.
Um,
Right. Yeah.
That's also an indicator of the, you know, heat death of the universe. Like that heat coming out is power you're not actually getting. So the efficiency is horrific. You know, you're losing half of the, well, probably not half, but maybe reasonably close to half. You're losing half of that power to operate that thing.
Yeah.
Versus what you're spending to get it.
Right, which he will come back to when he talks about the incandescent light. One of the things he mentions Elizabeth Colbert a lot in this book, and
I haven't noticed that. Who is she? And
she wrote The Sixth Extinction recently.
Okay.
Yeah, but she wrote. She's written other things. Field Notes from a Catastrophe. Under a White Sky is the most recent one, I think.
I mean, I have Sixth Extinction and 1 or 2 of those in my list, but they're a little far down the list.
Yeah. The person that I think he probably, I haven't seen a bibliography of this, but the other person that I thought about when I was reading a lot of this was Maggie Kurth Baker. Who was she's probably most famous for being one of the main contributors and editors of Boing Boing, with
Cory Doctorow.
With Cory, but she wrote a book, and she lived in Minneapolis, I guess is the other thing that I knew about her. But she lived in South Minneapolis, kind of near where I used to live. But she wrote a book called Before the Lights Go Out: Conquering the Energy Crisis Before It Conquers Us, which is really, and I don't agree with all of her conclusions, but she does a really, really good job of sort of explaining to people just becoming acquainted with the system, you know, like what the grid is and how it works the way it does and why it operates in real time, you know, and all that kind of stuff. And so that, so that was kind of an interesting, you know, I was reminded of that a lot when I kind of while I was reading this.
Just actually noticing too, and because I don't have a physical copy of the book, my inspectional read is sorely lacking.
Mm-hmm.
But even scanning through the tail end of the book, he has like a 2 or 3 page acknowledgments of gratitude. He has like a page and a half on a note on the sources where he does where he mentions Orestes and Conway, which I think is, you know, fascinating, and Elizabeth Colbert. And he, you know, he gives a nod to Christopher Nolan, but there are there's no bibliography here. There's no actual sources. There's no, if you wanted to track down any of these quotes,
Right.
where would you find them? That it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So in terms of a popular public press book, this is the super close end of like, this is meant for the public. We're not even going to give you footnotes.
Right.
Like, we're not even going to attempt to, but I'll say thanks to a couple of famous people
Right.
who are popular now. I'm not going to like give any credit to that newspaper reporter in 1896.
Yes.
He gave me this great quote. Like, screw that. Like,
Mhm. I agree. It's that is unfortunate because once we get to the end, to the third section, and these people like Siegfried Singer, or Christopher Monckton, Lord Christopher, not a member of the House of Lords. Yeah, I would love to know where this information, where the background.
And it's fine if you want to do it as a published book and you don't want to scare people off with a big chunky index and 50. This should, based on what's in this book, there should be a good 50 to 70 pages of like footnotes,
Absolutely,
and references,
absolutely,
and at least a 4-page bibliography.
Well, and you can put it on a website.
I was going to say it's fine not to put it out there and publish it.
Yeah.
And particularly if you want to save the manufacturer cost of something very few are likely to read.
Right.
But for me, I want that, and at least put it on a website, and
Yeah, it's interesting. That came up at the conference that I was at because they were, it was mostly about open textbook publishing, but there was actually Cable Green, the guy who runs Creative Commons, came and gave one of the keynotes, and he's involved in a project about open access science because apparently Creative Commons has decided to sort of focus on climate change and life on under the water and life on Earth, which are the UNESCO sustainability goals 13, 14, and 15, as kind of their next big thing that they're going to look at. And his point was that it's going to be very hard to do something about climate change if he said there are like 100 between 1980 and 2020, 169,000 published articles, but 53% of them are behind big paywalls, right? So the information is not publicly available unless you can pay these big fees to get access to the stuff. And so he's sort of pushing for open. His point is really that anything that is made, any knowledge that is created with public funds should automatically be available freely, right? Which I think makes perfect sense.
I've actually been, for the last, maybe it started 6 months or a year ago, I've sat on calls with people in the ed tech space, and there are some now, especially who are at the university, like the bigger umbrella institutional level, who are at least bringing up the question, okay, let's say we have these OER resources. What is the cost to the environment to put them up and have them on a server that's always on and always drawing electricity so it's always available? And what does that long-term cost look like, particularly when we're doing it at large scale?
Mm-hmm.
So at least we're thinking about, like, yes, we should have these resources and they should be there, but what is the physical cost of having them always there versus the return that they may get for always being on?
Mm-hmm.
But at least I'm hearing and seeing that question pop up on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm.
That people are starting now to think about that. And it's similar to the same way that, I don't know, maybe it was probably started about 6 years ago, I think. I was in circles where people were using pronouns and it didn't exist in the zeitgeist yet at all. And I remember going to a Planned Parenthood fundraiser dinner, and it was the first time I had seen an event have pins and buttons that had pronouns on them. And I had friends who were like, what are these things and why should we care?
Mhm.
And literally, I'm the one explaining to some of the people who worked at Planned Parenthood, like, this is what they're for, and I recommend you put them on to help normalize it for everyone else.
Mhm.
Like, oh, yeah, I would never have in a million years thought to do that as a thing.
Yeah,
And that is now more commonplace. So I'm
sure.
hoping these cycles continue on, and maybe 4 or 5 years from now, everybody's thinking about what. Yeah, I was doing my annual watching of the Office the other day when they had the big banner up, and it said, the big banner that shows up over Milton, is this good for the company?
Mhm. It's funny, the one of the that reminds me of one of the things that and I don't think that they're pursuing it as diligently as they were the last conference that I went to in 2019, but LibreTexts, which is they exist at UC Davis. Delmar Larson runs them, and they run they sort of they claim to be the biggest set of open texts and textbooks and homework and ancillary stuff out there, because and basically the way that they achieved that was they scraped the web of everything they could find, which some people were offended by, but I don't have a problem with that. One of the things that they did for a while was they had taken it all and put it on this tiny little device, like on a what amounted to really a big thumb drive. I think right now it might be like a little Raspberry Pi, but that they were aware that there were people not only in the developing world, but in remote areas of the developed world who don't have the bandwidth to be connected to these always on servers where all this information exists. So I thought that was kind of an interesting sort of a partial response to part of what you're saying, Chris. But also, I wonder, in terms of, kind of when the machine stops, in the E.M. Forster, kind of way of looking at that, what is left of this thing that we're creating. It is kind of interesting. That we now just sort of take for granted that we will always have. That will always be connected to that thing. I mean, I noticed it actually with, it's just sort of with respect to my devices, as I'm going from, hotel to, in Regina, to hotel in Edmonton, to the conference center, and, once I put in, my password to the Wi-Fi that's available, it's like, oh yeah, I'm just, the cloud is here with me and I'm connected. And it's just, I mean, and 5 or 10 years ago that would have not been the case. It would have been very difficult and time consuming and required some
I'll give you a good example too. Is I'm sitting here and I've got my Kindle on,
Mhm.
and I sat it down for 3 minutes and it turned off. I have to hit the power button, put the password in to get back into it. And I'm thinking, boy, this is annoying.
Yep.
But then I'm thinking, the amount of energy this uses versus reading on my computer with a super bright LED backlit screen and a bigger power source that's, and this Kindle, takes in an hour, more or less, I can charge it up and it's good for 2 or 3 weeks.
Right.
Even with reasonable heavy use.
Yeah.
So which one's the better thing that I should be reading on more often? Whether it's useful or not in terms of the amount of energy, but hey, I have to log into the damn thing every time. That's such an inconvenience. But I should just pull out my laptop instead.
Yep.
So it's those small little turns of, or 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 I should be like Dan and just pick up the book and although the amount of power and energy processing the wood and pulp in that thing cost, although I'll give you credit that at least that book's been around for half a century.
This book has been around for half a century. So, and the reason that I got this, and I'm still trying to get the full set, but
Which edition? That looks like in the 80s.
This is I'll tell you, I think it's a very well preserved
88?
I think it's a 1952. I
Oh, is it?
Yeah, I think this is a very, very well preserved 1952. No, I'm sorry, you're right. It's 24th edition, 1984. Just
I was gonna say they didn't put gilt pages on the 52 edition.
Okay,
So.
all right, you're right. But the reason I got it was because it has Appendix 2, the principles and methods of syntopical construction, and it goes on for like 100 pages before you get to the inventory of terms. So, this is actually the I think the how did we do it section that they didn't put in the first Syntopicon, in the introduction in volume 2. So I'm super excited. That was waiting for me when I got back. I am going to highlight it. I've decided, I'm gonna deface this book, but I need to be able to actually.
You're not defacing it. You're moving from physical ownership to mental ownership.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is that's what Adler and Hutchins would have said, and they did say that. So.
Which volume is that? Is that the second?
This is 3. This is volume 3. So it's part 2 of the Syntopicon, which is another. I mean, it's amazing. The Syntopicon is, it's 1,350 pages in volume 2. So crazy buggers. Volume 1 actually is right. It's still it's in the pile on my desk. Yeah, this is volume 2 of the set. Volume 1 of the Syntopicon, 1,082 pages. And this one also has gilt pages, so maybe it came from a different vendor on Abe Books. This is also a 1984 reprint of the original.
Here's the 52 edition. This is bibliography. Now that is a bibliography.
Yes, there's a beautiful, the bibliography in there as well. So I'm looking forward to, and I think I will, now we're way off topic, but I think I will separate all my stuff and actually start kind of focusing on this much more directly and talking about these things. I'm not committed to the whole 10-year Great Books reading program, although I might be willing to do that. I don't know. I think I'm at least going to kind of go through see what the Syntopicon has to say, see what their thought process about at least history, and then.
Well, you mentioned that the second appendix, because that was the thing I was looking for at the beginning of volume 2, when they're talking about how it works, and I would have thought they had more on. So I'm glad you mentioned it, because that would have been a couple more months before I would have noticed that section hiding in there.
Yeah, well, they clued me into it. I was happy because as I was reading the first one, they said, well, okay, we're gonna, at the end of that first section that I did kind of read, that introductory section, I read it and I highlighted it, and then somewhere along the way, towards the end of that, they say, yeah, we're gonna stop here, but if you really want to know the nuts and bolts, you can go and look at
and find 100 pages.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, so I quick ordered the thing, and while I was away for the week, it arrived. So I'm excited about that.
That edition you got actually is probably one of the better ones in terms of long-term stand-up, hold on some of this, the 50s, the 52 edition was reasonably good. The 70s was a horrible, those are falling apart.
Oh, well, this one is this. I noticed. I
In
think,
terms of manufacturer, like for
yeah,
beating up.
I think what I noticed about this is that the pages are super thin. You know, it's 1,300 pages long, and these pages are really thin. But then when you get back to the appendix, I think it is slightly better. I think it's slight. The page, just these pages are slightly more robust. So,
Yeah.
so they went with a different stock for the.
Well, you can't. I don't think there are any printers in America anymore that are capable of printing and binding more than 1,100 pages in a book.
Yeah.
They don't exist. So usually you find things like that would now be 2 volumes, because during the pandemic, I think there were 2 large printers that went out of business. And they're not going to come back. And I think one of them was one of the few who still could do books of that length.
Yeah. I mean, it's a stitched binding and everything. Yeah. I mean, I don't think anybody does that anymore. I mean,
Yeah. Well, these days, a lot of publishers will still put that little bit of cloth at the end to make it look like
it's a fake
it's a stitch binding, but it's not. It's totally phony.
Yeah.
And I'm like, what? But you're so used to that being part of the form of your books.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm trying to see if I probably have got one that's like that, but it's like that's a thing that makes it look like a book, so they still put it on,
right,
even though it has nothing to do with how your book works anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. It is
it's like putting a full grill onto an electric vehicle.
Yep.
There's no radiator and you don't need airflow, so you don't need that grill.
Mm-hmm.
But some electric car makers are still putting a grill-like thing, because otherwise your car looks weird and nobody wants to buy it.
It does, yeah. That kind of that Model 3 nose is, yeah. They do have some scoops for airflow for battery cooling at the bottom, but yeah, they yeah. So yeah, so I think I think my reaction to this now, kind of looking at it more closely, is I probably appreciate it more, and I probably will kind of go through and highlight some things, and and kind of pull them into my notes and stuff, because I do think that there are a couple of things in here. Yeah, the Tesla Westinghouse Edison Morgan story, I don't know that there are going to be any surprises for me there, but in some of these other things, some of these other connections that he makes.
Well, it's to me, it plays as it. I don't know. For my taste, it's further away from the original sources than I wish it was, and doesn't footnote or provide me with any of that.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd rather have bits and pieces of some of the originals. So it makes a good like introduction to the space.
Yeah.
Especially for the climate science stuff that I know exists, but I have never taken a hard look at to say, here's kind of the depth and breadth of where it started with the early basic science and where it's gone. So that is a good kind of introductory read.
Yeah.
But I'm also the type I'd rather kind of delve into those primary sources a little more in depth. Yeah. But it does seem like the kind of book at least I could pick up and give to the 10 friends who just don't have any conceptualization of any of what's going on, other than I hear this might be an important thing and I'm willing to believe the scientists on it, but I'm not going to delve further.
Yeah.
In fact, actually, one of the quirkiest things, and I didn't quite understand it when I heard it, or I heard it, it came and it went and it didn't register at all. And then when I read it, I was like, oh, that's kind of weird. He used the phrase antiquing NPR somewhere in the opening. And I was like, it was kind of a throwaway thing, and I was like, what the hell does that mean? And it took me a minute to realize, like, I live in Connecticut, and I'm gonna go antiquing in Vermont this weekend. I'm gonna find some interesting things to pull out of history that maybe I could put in my house.
Mhm.
I was like,
Like an ice box.
that is what he is saying.
Yep.
He literally uses the phrase antiquing to describe spelunking through old NPR articles as interesting sources for this stuff,
Mhm.
and how he envisioned his process. And I was like, it's such a nice piece of poetry, but you're gonna slide right past it.
But it
But
is, and it's such an inside joke.
it was such a weird phrase. I was like, holy crap, like.
Yeah. Mhm.
But I like that idea of antiquing through old material.
Yeah.
The as a historian, like
Mhm.
I'm gonna go antiquing through Thucydides next weekend.
Right. Yeah. Like a real antiquarian. Yeah.
Um,
It's interesting. I do think that there are interesting, there's an interesting story behind this story about sort of this infrastructural thing, because it goes, it's to what you said earlier, Chris, about the about the relative amounts, how much did it take to make the light bulb, how much did it take to make the power plant, kind of thing. There is a story of this gas infrastructure that that he's talking about. Edison is aware of, sort of the way the gas companies work, and the way they've got gas lines under the streets of New York and things like that. And there's a business structure that also kind of is part of that. That is, that it would be interesting to kind of look at, how his, how Edison, or who it was working for Edison, who kind of made those connections. Yeah, he also talks about chug over country. Did you notice that?
yeah, Chug Over Country was another one I highlighted too. I was like, wow. And that was another one of those like kind of pseudo like retcon like modernisms that he injects as part of his,
Yeah.
antiquing NPR and chug over country.
Well, and yeah, and the he talks about these people in the same, in the he compares, or you were talking about kind of these analogies that don't quite work. One of the other ones that I thought maybe didn't quite work was there's one point where he's talking about sort of contemporary tech billionaires, and and making some type of a assuming that we understand how how they are how they are similar to, and how they might be different from the people who were doing these things then.
I do have a question since you finished it, Dan. Would this be the kind of book you would give to either someone who is on the fence with respect to whether there's a climate crisis or not, or to someone who is a modest denier
Yeah.
for identity reasons, and in large part because they've never read anything of any depth on the subject other than I heard it on Fox News and they say it's wrong, so would you give this book to them in hopes that it would change their mind?
And I think I would, and I think it might, because I think maybe the advantage to this is that, unlike Eric Conway and Naomi Oreskes in Merchants of Doubt, for example, where they really kind of go head first at those people, he finds some people who you couldn't defend, and he tells the story of them, and makes them sort of personally obnoxious enough that it's kind of easy to see, and also he does a really good job, maybe as good, maybe even better than Oresky's and Conway did, of connecting the the denial of secondhand smoke, especially, to and the tobacco industry's efforts to, because basically his thesis later on will be that that climate denial is the fruit of this tree that the tobacco industry planted, and it just didn't it didn't grow and bear fruit in time. It was just slightly too late for them, but it was in time for climate. And that actually, and he tells this story. He tells a very good story of the tobacco industry beginning to use climate change or warming as an example that they can, with which they can sort of denigrate scientists and science, right? And that sort of, it's sort of like collateral damage in a way that they create, as a way of saying, as yeah, the way they start, they think that it's a soft target, right? And they think that that obviously it's much more difficult to defend smoking, but if we can soften people up and make them distrust scientists by going after this easy thing, then and that sort of opens the door and creates this situation. It does, what one thing that he could have probably, I think he might have done better is, talk about this transition to coal, right? And because initially we're talking, in this scientist section, we're talking about Westinghouse and and Niagara Falls, which is, yeah, let's do that. Let's do more of that. Let's find lots of opportunities to do hydro, because we're not, this is the period. He doesn't make, I don't think he puts a fine enough point on the fact that initially this is not a carbon problem. Right? So so it's later when we get to digging up all these coal fields and the growth of that, and he doesn't tell that story at all. It was kind of weird because as I was listening to this, I was driving through Saskatchewan on the way to Alberta, and just north of, just south actually, in northern North Dakota, and then on the other side, I began to see oil wells, and so there are so there are wheat fields, but then then there's occasional well, and then there are more of them, and then there are these big storage tanks, and then of course I was in Edmonton, home of the Oilers and home of Enbridge, and Enbridge has a big, they got a skyscraper in downtown Edmonton, and so that was a little bit weird. I didn't go through any. I did see some kind of sandy, tarry spots in places where where they couldn't plow it, but I did not see any tar sands being worked. Apparently, that's in the several hundred miles north of Edmonton. Yeah. But yeah.
It's interesting too that you mentioned the kind of the northern reaches, because I've been doing some reading on early Scandinavians up until like the time of what we popularly call the Viking invasions of Europe, into like the 1200s. And I'm doing it looking for a group of people who have a heavy oral culture that's moving into literacy almost overnight, rather than the longer development time that the Greeks and Romans did. But there's some interesting examples there of them going to Greenland and Iceland and kind of being pushed out of some of those spaces because the climate is so rough,
Yeah.
and humble. And it's even for people who are experienced, people living in those colder northern climes, like how do you still manage to pull it off?
Yeah.
Has been interesting reading that while I'm reading this.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the Little Ice Age was apparently, pretty severe by about 1400. They get
Yeah.
chased out of Greenland, and up until then, they're doing pretty well. And yeah, and it's interesting because I use there's a map of Greenland that I use from like the 1720s, I think, that has this. I mean, they drew in this channel that goes through the center of Greenland, that you can sail. You used to be able to sail through, they say, and this is a Norse map in the early 1700s, and they're looking back at this tradition that's several hundred years old already, and they've made up these stories about how you could sail right through the center, but now it's choked up with ice. Yeah.
Well, the other thing that strikes me too is there is a higher level of male female equity because of how they were living so roughly that
Mhm.
they had to give more power to women to do the daily running of the home or deal with property rights, particularly when the men were going off to sea and either going a Viking and raiding, or they were going out to catch fish and then bring back.
Right.
So you go out for a couple weeks or a month and you need your equal partner at home, like keeping, to use a horrible phrase, not appropriate to the time, but appropriate here, I guess, to keep the lights on.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and the settlement in Newfoundland that they found, has a one of the structures had it was a spinning house, right? And so they had, they found all kinds of paraphernalia, weights and spindles and things like that, that suggested that there were people, doing, making textiles, which seems, and they said they traded milk, that the thing that the natives wanted most was milk. So they brought cattle with them, right? So this suggests, that in Newfoundland in 1000, between 1000 and 1100, they were thinking much more long term. It wasn't just a seasonal fishing camp, where you're gonna throw your cod on, salt it and throw it on racks for a couple months and then sail away.
I did hear an interesting anthropology and archaeological story related to that trading of milk. They came and they did it, and then they went away and came back a few months later, and the indigenous peoples then attacked them and drove them out. And the supposition was that they had all this milk and they gave it to the indigenous peoples who may have been lactose intolerant. And now
they made them all sick.
So here's the food stuff, and we see them eating and drinking it, and we did the same thing, and it did terrible things to us. So they must have been trying to poison us to take over our space. So kill them and get them out of here.
Interesting. Well, that
didn't come back.
Yeah, and that actually suggests that the sources, because the source the primary source that I have, the story of of the milk from is from the sagas, and so at least at one point when they were writing about it, the Vikings, the Norsemen were saying this is what they wanted. They only wanted this. They didn't want, we had nothing else that we could interest them in, and but who knows? I mean, who knows whether that's
saga?
What's that?
Do you remember which saga that was in?
It's the Bjarni Haraldsson one. That's the one that most people go to. Where that's the one where Leif tries to get Eric the Red to come along, and he falls off his horse and all that. So I think it's in part of that story.
Yeah, I didn't have I had a pointer to a journal article that made the supposition about the lactose intolerance. But
That
I didn't have the saga pointer, so I
right.
can put the two together.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. You would think that, if they did that and they all got they were all, you know, they all got like explosive diarrhea for a week, that would be that would be a
And
suggestion.
we're all dying. We're all
Yeah.
dying.
Yeah. Well, and we don't hear that much actually about um there being any type of Columbian exchange, any type of passing of actual disease to people at this time.
Yeah.
But that's entirely possible too, that contagious disease might have gone along with this, and might have all been part of a package
Yeah.
of things.
If only the Indians had the telegraph and they could have told all the others,
Mm-hmm.
then
Yep.
then Amherst's plan to kill him with smallpox would not have gone so well.
Yes, these execrable creatures, he called them. Yep.
Just it really makes me want to go to UMass Amherst and
Yeah. And well,
Amherst itself, and
yep. And there's there's the Lord Jeffrey Inn is still there, and Amherst College, and yeah, they by the time that I was there in the 80s, they were starting, people were starting to talk about that. But yeah, it's crazy. In Canada, they're very, they were sort of way ahead. I mean, at the university, of course, we do land acknowledgement and all that kind of stuff. But they seem to have been, there actually seem to have been, some type of positive effect of, decades of truth and reconciliation, work that they've been trying to do. But yeah, I think there's although I had some mixed feelings about how much emphasis and how new this is, relative to things like pedagogy of the oppressed and decolonization efforts and things like that as well.
well, we're at least making the effort to turn some of these older sites into with the one in Illinois, I think just became a UNESCO heritage status.
Mm.
Yep. So.
Yep. Okay, so for next week, we got the scientists. And I think that actually does have a lot of sort of new information for me that I will be making, kind of making note of and connecting some dots with other things that are in my notes.
Yeah. This next section and the third section are the ones that I'm showing up for. Like that. That's fine.
Yeah.
In retrospect, had I known what was going to be in the first section, I would have said we should have read the first two sections together.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. I agree.
Except it is a good bit to plow through while you're also, reading about Vikings in the 7th century.
Yep. Yep. And and a little bit of Graeber on the side.
Oh yeah, well yeah, I was going to say I probably got through. I'm actually kind of glad that I'm listening to the Graeber audiobook version first.
Mm-hmm.
Just get the inspectional read out of the way so I can delve into it a little more deeply. And I'd never thought of it that way, that audiobooks are good for doing that quick inspectional read, especially when you can put it up to 1.5 or 2 times talking speed.
Yep. I listened to them both. That's the way I got through both of them, I suppose, was I was listening to them at 1.5. But in the Graeber, I was thinking, oh my God, I almost pulled over a couple times and made myself a voice memo, but I thought, okay, I'm going to go through this, anyway with the eye reading. So,
you hit the little bookmark button selectively.
Yeah.
And then you can come back to those spots a little more easily.
Yep. Okay.
So,
all right, cool. Last words?
Beware those who would give you dairy, I think,
Yeah.
are the words of wisdom we should all take away.
It is, yes. Yes.
I don't know how we came up with that out of reading this first section on
Yep.
I mean, I know how we got to it, but I without the context of what happened here in the last 10 minutes, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, no one will know.
How
Yeah.
did she go from Tesla and Morse
The dairy
Dairy.
is problematic. Yeah.
Well, and actually, we could go further to fermentation, and
Mm.
because they might have done better if they had not tried to trade fresh milk. But
True.
I don't know. I have no idea what native traditions there might be surrounding fermentation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know nothing about that either.
So it may be that that lactobacillus and all these yeasts are part of the Columbian exchange as well, and we're not something that, although they did have, in I guess now that I think of it, in Mesoamerica and South America, they did have chicha and stuff like that, so they were fermenting things. So anyway, that's a tangent for another day.
I think that's a book that should be written.
Yes.
History through the lens of dairy and fermentation, maybe both.
Yeah.
Overlap.
All right.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And I will see you all again on
Next week.
Saturday. Take care.
Thanks, Dan. See you.
Bye-bye.